Hey, good morning. I'm Gabriel Spitzer. It's Monday. This is Seattle Now. Washington State has big clean energy goals, but with the looming deadline of 2045 to have zero emission energy across the state, people are starting to ask, are these goals actually achievable? We'll get into that with Greg Kim from the Seattle Times in a minute, but first, let's get you caught up. As if we needed more troubling food safety news, a salmonella outbreak linked to jalapeno peppers imported from Sinaloa, Mexico, has sickened more than 300 people across the U.S., including one case in Washington. So far, no deaths have been reported. Investigators traced the outbreak to Coast Citrus Distributors, which supplies restaurants, including Chipotle and Qdoba. Both chains have stopped serving the affected peppers, and the FDA says there is no ongoing risk at their restaurants. More help could be coming soon for people living in their vehicles. Seattle City Council member Dan Strauss has announced several bills aimed at creating pathways to housing. One proposal would allow the city of Seattle to store people's vehicles once they're able to access a place to live. He also wants to invest $5 million in direct outreach for people living in their vehicles. The council will discuss the proposals Tuesday morning at 9:30. And a massive piece of property known as the Old Rainier Brewery is up for sale. The Seattle Times reports the mixed-use complex in SoDo is on the market for $29 million. That's down more than 15% from a year ago. Despite the giant neon R that's hard to miss, beer hasn't been brewed there since 1999. According to the paper, the property contains 25 buildings that are home to business tenants, music studios, and lofts where you can live and work. We'll be back with more headlines on tonight's episode of Seattle Now. Washington State is looking to lead the nation in the fight against climate change. And that's why back in 2019, the legislature passed the Clean Energy Transformation Act. It's a multi-step plan to get Washington to clean energy by 2045. Just last year, utility companies largely phased out coal-based energy production. But now utility companies and even lawmakers are questioning how realistic that 2045 goal is. Greg Kim is here from the Seattle Times Climate Lab. He's been looking into Washington's progress, and he's here to talk now about what could happen between now and 2045. Thanks for coming in, Greg.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So why don't we start with the basics here? What is the goal that Washington lawmakers set for energy production in the state by 2045?
Yeah, the big goal is that by 2045, we want all of the electricity sold in Washington to customers to be 100% clean or renewable.
In particular, we're talking about carbon emissions, right?
Yeah.
All right. So when they set this goal back in 2019, how much of the state's energy production at that time came from polluting sources like fossil fuels?
Washington had a really good head start in this, in that like 60% of our power comes from hydropower, which is renewable. The answer can be different depending on which utility. And so some utilities like PSC or Puget Sound Energy, they were getting the majority of their power from fossil fuels.
All right. Well, you mentioned hydropower, which the rivers run pretty much 24/7, right? With a little bit of variation depending on how high the water levels are. What about wind and solar? How far has that gotten us to this 100% renewable goal?
There's another aspect besides just getting our existing power usage to be completely clean, right? Because our power usage is expected to grow a tremendous amount over the next 2 decades, right? And so it's not just about replacing our current electricity that's generated by fossil fuels into clean energy. It's about meeting all of that additional demand with clean energy. And so that's a big problem that most utilities will be facing going forward, even if they are mostly clean today.
What's driving that increased demand?
It's nearly all in the long-term electric vehicles and building heat pumps. And those
not data centers.
Data centers are a big part of the electricity demand going forward into the next 5 or 6 years. That's the short term. But in the longer term, over the next 2 decades, nearly all of it is EVs and building heat pumps.
That's interesting because we've had so many incentives and measures passed to encourage electrification and of home heating or building heating and transportation and so on. And this is sort of the knock on the back end, do we actually have enough electricity to power all of that technology?
Yeah, and utilities are saying that they're going to be struggling really hard to keep up with that demand.
So what kind of options are they considering in order to plan for a future where we have, 50 to 100% more electricity use than today?
Utilities are saying they're going to try to meet the state law as closely as possible. So they're racing to add wind and solar as fast as they can. But they are facing two constraints with that. In the short term, it's first of all, just even getting the wind and solar power over to us. Your listeners may have heard about the transmission constraints. That's the power lines that are delivering power over. And so in the short term, it can be difficult to get wind and solar power to the customers that need them, right? But even if that were possible, even if you were to remove that constraint, they say that wind and solar power still has a long-term limitation because they are only available at certain times. And actually in the Northwest, they're least available at the times that we need power most.
Say more about that. How does the supply and demand line up in that way?
Yeah, so in the Northwest, we need power most during the winter, right? When it's really cold, people are turning up the heat, increasingly with heat pumps. And especially during cold snaps that last multiple days, that's when we need power most. And during those times, the same high-pressure weather systems that can bring those extremely low temperatures can also stall winds. And during the winter, we have earlier sunsets, and so they have less solar power that they can count on. And so there's this gap that utilities say that exists into the long term that wind and solar just can't be relied on for these winter cold snaps that they're still expected to keep the power on.
So what's the alternative that the utilities are using?
They basically say there's two theoretical solutions, right? One is batteries. And we're starting to see a lot of these big battery projects being added, but there's still limitations with existing battery technology in that they're lithium ion. They can only hold a charge of 4 to 8 hours. And so in this scenario we're talking about where they have cold snaps for multiple days, you'd need so many batteries basically stacked on top of each other to last you through that cold snap that utilities are saying that you would need an unrealistic amount of batteries to be able to last you through that.
And those are also controversial, right?
They're also controversial, yeah. A lot of communities in Puget Sound are starting to temporarily ban them or restrict them. They don't want them in their backyard. So that's a solution that utilities are saying is pretty much infeasible, which leads them to their only solution that they're saying really exists, which is power plants powered by natural gas. Natural gas is a fossil fuel, and burning it is cleaner than coal. It emits about half the amount of carbon, but it's still a fossil fuel. PSE and these energy analysts are saying we'll use gas peakers. And so these are a certain type of gas plant. They don't run 24/7. They're basically off by default. And within minutes, you can fire them up during these periods when demand peaks or when wind and solar aren't on fully, and use gas just in these rare times to fire up power.
So it still creates pollution. It still emits greenhouse gases. And in fact, like when there are leaks of unburned gas, that can be even worse, right, for global warming.
Right. The half the carbon emissions is only when they're burning it. There can be leaks upstream that you just talked about, like in the pipeline, and methane releasing into the atmosphere itself is a greenhouse gas that can warm the planet.
So they're saying it's important for us to build gas-powered electricity capacity to meet this growing demand. What does the law say about that?
The law says they're allowed to do that until 2045, but the law says by 2045 we need 100% clean power, so that would mean that we can't run these gas plants to produce electricity here in the state after that.
So why would you build it feels like power plants are like generational investments, right? They're supposed to be around for decades and decades. Why would you build a bunch of power plants fueled by gas if they're going to be illegal in 20 years?
That's one where what the utilities are saying are not what climate advocates think that they are thinking. The motives there are somewhat unclear, okay? And so utilities are saying they can convert gas plants to be clean later on by that deadline potentially. And so the way they would do that is they would convert these plants to run on renewable fuels, say hydrogen or biodiesel, or maybe they do carbon capture and capture the carbon coming out of the gas plants before they enter the atmosphere, and then they would comply with the law, right? What climate advocates are afraid of, though, is that they'll build these plants saying they'll do that, but then not be able to do it by that deadline and say, oh crap, we spent billions of dollars building these plants and we have no other way to keep the power on during these cold snaps. And so that will basically corner lawmakers into changing the law by having spent all that money on those infrastructure.
Interesting. Okay, so it's like they'll have all these sunk costs, and because these companies have a lot of juice in Olympia, they would have influence over potentially making exceptions in the law or weakening it in some way.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So first of all, how realistic is it that these gas plants could become clean power generators in the next couple of decades? I mean, you talked about, what did you said? Carbon capture, hydro, and biodiesel. Do those technologies, are they ready to go?
They exist, but they are not available at the scale or price that is useful to utilities at this point, right? And so they've been demonstrated they're possible, but they're not being used commercially widely, right? And so it's not a guarantee that they will become economical by the time 2045 comes around.
How important is that timeline? Is 2045 an arbitrary year, or is it sort of pegged to something?
I don't know that 2045 was pegged to anything on the scientific timeline. Obviously, the sooner we can get rid of carbon emissions, the better. People expect us to be able to get to 100% clean energy at some point. The energy experts are saying that it's unlikely that we'll get to those technological breakthroughs and the manufacturing breakthroughs by 2045. They do think they will come eventually, right? And so there are people in the utility industry who are also saying that as well, and saying like, we were just a little bit too early in our goal. We were just a little bit too ambitious. If we had given us a little bit more time, maybe we'd be able to hit it, right? And so then there are climate advocates that are saying we can buy more time. And, you know, a lot of this that we're talking about, this need for gas or something to fill this gap, is driven because we are driving up electricity demand so much so fast. And they're saying if we can kind of slow that down, not by like slowing down our transition to EVs and heat pumps, that's still really necessary for climate. But if we can use a little bit less, especially in those peak times, that's the biggest problem that we're talking about. Whether that's through mandatory EV charging at night, that's not something we have right now. Or if we curtail data centers on the coldest days of the winter, those are some really big wins that are somewhat low-hanging fruit in climate advocates' eyes. The data center industry would not say that. They're saying that that would buy us some additional time and allow for these emerging technologies to mature a little bit more to be able to be ready to step into that gap.
So really go after the demand side a little bit more than just on the supply side.
Yeah. On the other hand, you talk to some Democratic lawmakers who aren't willing to say that quite so loudly publicly yet. But when you talk to them, you can read between the lines of what they're saying. They'll say things like, we acknowledge that it's going to be extremely challenging, but they're not willing to let go of that top line goal of 100% clean by 2045 yet. And they're saying that if we let go of that target now, then we could slip further. And so they're saying we're going to hold on to that, and holding on to it will at the very least get us as close to it as possible versus giving up on it now.
Yeah. Well, so much of this is a political question, right? And a lot of this originated during the Jay Inslee tenure in Olympia. And of course, he was, famously the climate governor. He was the climate candidate for president. And now he's gone. How much does that complicate the path forward for meeting this goal when you don't have such a high-profile political champion who's kind of got a mandate for it?
I think there's other things happening in politics besides Jay Inslee's departure that have created a different atmosphere for climate.
Oh, yeah. Say more.
I mean, you see a lot of big companies not talking about climate as loudly as they did maybe 5 or 6 years ago. You have President Trump in office who has shown that he does not like wind and solar projects, accelerating the federal government's removal of tax credits for them. And so it's a much different environment today than several years ago, not just because of Jay Inslee's departure.
So as this plays out and we have these competing dynamics of rising demand and this deadline approaching in 2045, how's it going to show up for consumers?
We're already seeing it. Puget Sound Energy's bills have risen something like 60% in the last 3 years, right? And that's for a lot of reasons, but this clean energy transition is a big part of that, as they're having to procure a lot of new generation resources, wind and solar, while having to ramp down the coal and fossil fuel that they relied on. It is going to be expensive, and Democratic lawmakers are becoming increasingly sensitive to that, and that's one of the outs that they're seeing here. There's already kind of a general exemption written into the state's climate law that says, like, hey, if this gets too expensive, utilities can get a pass, they can slow down, and they don't have to meet these targets that we set. And they're talking about basically widening those pathways to maintain affordability as we go forward.
Those sound like potentially big loopholes, because then who gets to decide what counts as affordable, right?
Right. It's a slippery slope. Deciding what is exempt or not is going to be a challenge.
All right. Well, a lot of moving parts here. Thank you for helping us kind of pick our way through it. Greg Kim is a Seattle Times Climate Lab reporter. Thank you so much, Greg.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Seattle Now. This show is possible thanks to our generous listeners. And before we go, our question of the week. Is it important that Seattle's next police chief lives in the city full time? Tell us why or why not. You can share your answer in the KUOW app, open the menu and select Talk to Us. More at kuow.org/question. Today's episode was produced by Brooklyn Jamerson Flowers. It was edited by Caroline Chamberlain Gomez. Our production team also includes Andy Hurst, Vaughn Jones, Patricia Murphy, and Paige Browning. Greg Kramer does our theme music. Seattle Now and KUOW Public Radio are members of the NPR network. I'm Gabriel Spitzer. Talk to you tonight for Evening Headlines.